A man sits alone in a small house on the edge of Las Vegas. It is New Year's week, 1970 into 1971. Nobody has seen him in days. When his wife finally returns home from a trip and pushes open the front door, the smell reaches her before anything else does. She finds him on the floor of the bedroom, a bottle of beer standing upright beside him, track marks on his arm that make no sense for a man who was terrified of needles his entire life. The coroner will call it a heroin overdose. Almost no one who knew him will believe it. He had been the most feared heavyweight on the planet, a fist so heavy that grown champions trembled at the sound of his name, and he would leave this world the same way he entered it, alone, poor in every way that mattered, and owned by other men. His name was Charles Sonny Liston, and this is the story of a man whose fists conquered the world and whose life was stolen by the very men who profited from those fists. He was the most devastating puncher of his generation, feared by every heavyweight who laced up gloves against him. And yet the man who terrified the entire boxing world could not read his own contracts, could not walk into most hotels in his own country, and could not even be certain, until the day he died, who actually owned a piece of his career. Number 1. The boy nobody counted. Charles Liston was born on a sharecropping farm near Sand Slough, Arkansas, sometime around 1930. Even that fact is uncertain. There was no birth certificate. For most of his life, nobody, including Liston himself, knew his real age with any confidence. He was one of 25 children fathered by Tobe Liston, a violent, illiterate tenant farmer who worked his children like livestock and beat them with whatever was closest at hand: a cotton sack strap, a plow line, his fists. Sonny later said his father hit him for no reason at all, just to be hitting. There was no school worth the name, no shoes most winters, and cotton to pick from before sunrise. By the time he was a teenager, Sonny Liston had never spent a full year in a classroom and could not write his own name. When his mother Helen finally left the farm for St. Louis in search of factory work, 13-year-old Sonny walked and hitchhiked over 400 miles to find her, arriving with nothing but the clothes on his back. St. Louis did not save him. It just gave him a different kind of poverty, one with alleys instead of cotton rows, and it did not take long before the size of his hands started attracting the wrong kind of attention. Number 2, a chaplain, a prison, and a pair of gloves. By 19, Liston was a serial armed robber, arrested repeatedly for mugging and holding up small businesses around St. Louis with a group of other young men. In 1950, he was convicted of 2 counts of armed robbery and sentenced to 5 years at the Missouri State Penitentiary, a prison so violent that inmates called it the bloodiest 47 acres in America. It was there, inside those walls, that a Catholic chaplain named Father Alois Stevens noticed something in the enormous, silent young inmate, a physical instrument unlike anything he had ever seen. Liston's reach was measured at 84 inches. His fists, when officials later tried to fit him for gloves, were the largest ever recorded for a heavyweight champion. Father Stevens got him access to the prison gym and connected him with local boxing figures on the outside. In 1952, after roughly 2 years served, Liston was paroled. He had walked into Missouri State Penitentiary, an illiterate street criminal with a police record. He walked out with something he had never had in his life, a skill the world was willing to pay for. But the men waiting for him outside those gates were not there out of charity, and the deal he was about to sign would follow him to his grave. Number 3, the amateur who never stayed an amateur for long. Liston's rise through the ranks had almost none of the slow, careful climb other fighters experienced. In 1953, barely a year removed from prison, he won the St. Louis Golden Gloves heavyweight title. Trainers who watched him work the heavy bag described something close to fear in their own reactions. A fighter who could end a bout with a single shot to the body before an opponent even understood the fight had started. His amateur career was short by design. There was no Olympic run, no years of polishing technique in front of judges. Promoters and managers wanted him in professional rings, earning money as fast as possible. He turned pro in September of 1953, and the resume that followed was almost absurd in its violence. Opponent after opponent falling in 1, 2, 3 rounds. A young man built like a monument, moving with a stillness and precision that made him look less like a boxer and more like a machine designed for a single purpose. Within a handful of years, there was only one man left between Sonny Liston and the heavyweight championship of the world. But getting to that fight would cost him something no amateur trophy could measure. Number 4. The night he became champion. On September 25, 1962, in Comiskey Park, Chicago, Sonny Liston stepped into the ring against Floyd Patterson, the reigning heavyweight champion of the world. Patterson was fast, technically gifted, and the sentimental favorite of a country that had already decided it did not want Liston, an ex-convict with mob whispers trailing him, wearing the crown. The fight lasted 2 minutes and 6 seconds. Liston hit Patterson with a combination that ended the contest before the first round could even settle into a rhythm, and Floyd Patterson, the champion of the world, was on the canvas, finished. Sonny Liston, the sharecropper's son who could not read the fight contract he had just fulfilled, was the heavyweight champion of the world. The rematch, in July of 1963, went even faster. 1 round, again. 2 title defenses, 2 knockouts, 2 minutes and change of total fighting time across both fights combined. He stood, by every measure the sport recognized, at the absolute summit of professional boxing. But the men standing closest to him at that summit were not there to protect what he had built. They were there to collect it. Number 5. A body built to be punished. Liston trained the way he had survived his entire life, by absorbing punishment without complaint. His camps were brutal even by the standards of professional heavyweight boxing. 5-6 hours a day of road work, heavy bag work, and sparring sessions that left training partners hospitalized. He fought at a walking-around weight that hovered close to 215 pounds, and unlike smaller division fighters starving themselves before a scale, Liston's punishment was different in kind but not in cruelty. Repeated blows to a head and body that had already absorbed a childhood of beatings, a prison sentence, and years of back-alley violence before a single professional bell ever rang. Reporters who visited his camps described a fighter who rarely spoke, who trained in near silence, and who seemed to treat his own body as something separate from himself, an instrument to be maintained and deployed, not protected. Ring doctors of the era kept minimal records. Nobody was tracking what accumulated blows to a skull that large, delivered and absorbed for over a decade, might eventually cost a man. Sonny Liston never asked the question either. He simply kept training, kept fighting, kept letting his body take what the sport demanded of it. And the men managing his career were far more interested in his fists than in what those fists were costing him. Number 6. The men who owned Sonny Liston. This is the part of Liston's story that boxing historians return to again and again, because it is the part that turns a sports story into an indictment. Liston's early managerial contracts were controlled, directly or through intermediaries, by figures tied to organized crime. Frank "Blinky" Palermo in Philadelphia and John Vitale in St. Louis, both connected to the underworld boxing network run by the man authorities called Mr. Gray. Frankie Carbo, a convicted felon who effectively controlled a shadow economy inside professional boxing for decades. Liston's official manager of record for years was a small-time St. Louis tavern owner named Pep Barone, a man with no real boxing background, widely understood inside the sport to be nothing more than a front, a name on paper, so the real owners could stay off the books. Liston himself later admitted, in one of his rare candid moments with a reporter, that he did not know exactly who controlled his percentages or where his purse money actually went after a fight. Contracts were signed that he could not read. Splits were arranged in rooms he was never invited into. The Kefauver Senate hearings on organized crime in boxing, convened in the early 1960s, dragged Liston's management arrangements into public testimony, and what emerged was a portrait of a heavyweight champion of the world who had less control over his own career earnings than the men skimming off the top of them. Several states, including New York, refused to license him to fight at all because regulators would not approve his ownership structure. The most feared man in boxing could knock out any opponent in the world in under 2 minutes, and he still could not get a straight answer about where his own money was going. It is difficult to overstate how thoroughly this arrangement defined the rest of his life. Every fight, every purse, every headline victory ran first through men who saw Sonny Liston not as a person, but as an asset, to be managed, minimized, and quietly liquidated whenever it served them. Number 7. The fights that broke the myth. On February 25, 1964, in Miami Beach, Liston defended his title against a loud, young, gifted challenger named Cassius Clay, a fighter almost nobody outside his own camp expected to survive the first round. Liston was a heavy favorite. Then something happened that boxing has argued about for 60 years. Clay outboxed him, moved him, cut him, and after the 6th round, Liston did not answer the bell for the 7th. He remained on his stool, citing a shoulder injury, and the title changed hands without the knockout everyone had expected in the other direction. The rematch, in May of 1965, in the small town of Lewiston, Maine, produced one of the most disputed moments in sports history. Barely more than a minute into the first round, Clay, now known as Muhammad Ali, threw a short right hand. Liston went down. Many in attendance, including ringside reporters, said afterward they never saw the punch land cleanly at all. It became known, forever, as the Phantom Punch. Liston did not get up in time. The referee's count was chaotic and confused. And Sonny Liston, the man who had ended 2 heavyweight championship fights in a combined 2 minutes, was now remembered less for what his fists had done, and more for a knockout that large portions of the public refused to believe was real. Whispers followed him for the rest of his life, that he owed money to dangerous people, that the fix was in, that a man connected to organized crime figures for his entire career had, at some point, stopped fighting for himself and started fighting for someone else's instructions. Liston never gave a satisfying explanation. He rarely spoke to the press about it at all. But the humiliation of that night in Maine followed him more heavily than any physical injury a legitimate opponent had ever inflicted. Number 8. Fighting his way back to nowhere. Stripped of the mystique that had made him the most feared man in boxing, Liston spent the rest of the 1960s doing what he had always done, fighting, in smaller venues, for smaller purses, trying to rebuild a reputation that had been shattered in one disputed minute in Maine. He relocated to Las Vegas, took fights in Sweden and elsewhere, and put together a modest late-career win streak against opponents far from championship caliber. Behind the scenes, the poverty he thought he had escaped in Arkansas was closing back in. Money that should have accumulated across a heavyweight championship reign had never truly belonged to him in the first place, funneled instead through the same network of managers and associates who had controlled him from his earliest professional fights. Friends and journalists who visited him in Las Vegas in his final years described a quiet, isolated man, still physically imposing, but increasingly dependent on alcohol, surrounded by associates whose business dealings ranged from loan sharking to narcotics distribution. He owed money. He was seen, more than once, in the company of men law enforcement was actively investigating. The system that had built him into a heavyweight champion had never once, at any point in the process, been designed to let Sonny Liston keep what he earned. It had been designed to extract from him for as long as his fists still worked, and to discard him the moment they stopped being profitable. Number 9. A death nobody has ever fully explained. Sonny Liston was last seen alive around December 30th, 1970. His wife Geraldine had been visiting family and returned to their Las Vegas home on January 5th, 1971, to find him dead in the bedroom, a partially finished can of beer beside him. The official autopsy listed the cause of death as heart failure and lung congestion, with evidence of heroin and morphine in his system, consistent with an overdose. But the details never sat right with the people who knew him. Sonny Liston had a lifelong, documented terror of needles, refusing injections even for basic medical treatment throughout his career. Investigators found track marks on his arm inconsistent with the pattern of a longtime user. There was no needle recovered at the scene. Las Vegas police conducted only a limited investigation before closing the case. To this day, biographers, journalists, and members of his own family maintain that Sonny Liston did not die by his own hand, that the same underworld network that had controlled his career from the moment he walked out of Missouri State Penitentiary made the decision, one final time, about what happened to his body. He was somewhere between 38 and 40 years old, though even his death certificate could not say for certain, because no one had ever bothered to properly record the year he was born. Boxing historian Nick Tosches, who spent years researching Liston's life, put it plainly. Sonny Liston's entire existence, from a cotton field in Arkansas to a bedroom floor in Las Vegas, was a life lived inside systems built by other men, for other men's benefit. He was the most feared heavyweight of his era, and he never once, from his first professional contract to his final hours, appeared to have full control over his own story. In 1991, 20 years after his death, Sonny Liston was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. The plaque could not undo what the men around him had taken. His fists conquered the world, and the men who profited from those fists made sure the world never conquered anything for Sonny Liston himself. The most feared man in boxing was never the one holding the power. If you think Sonny Liston's story deserves to be remembered honestly, subscribe. There are more stories like his that need to be told. And tell us in the comments, do you believe boxing, and the men who ran it, ever gave Sonny Liston what he was actually owed?